He is 57 years old, now a living legend who spent a lifetime outrunning defenders' expectations and the crushing weight of greatness. And yet the truth he carries today is heavier than anyone ever imagined. Barry Sanders. The most elusive runner the sport has ever witnessed has finally allowed himself to look back at the hidden forces that shaped his rise, his silence, and his shocking exit. His voice is calm. His presence is still humble. But behind that stillness lies a story he never intended to tell. For decades, fans wondered why he walked away so suddenly. Why a man at the peak of his power vanished from the game he mastered. Why Detroit's brightest star left the field without a farewell, without a press conference, without a final run. The questions echoed across generations. Was it frustration? Was it betrayal? Was it burnout? Or was it something deeper, something darker, something Detroit never wanted the public to know? Today, we uncover the 6 hidden truths that defined Barry Sanders. Not the highlight reels, not the trophies, not the impossible cuts that left defenders frozen in disbelief, but the truths he carried quietly while the world expected miracles from him. The truth about the people who failed him. The truth about the decisions that broke his faith. The truth about the silence he used as a shield. And the truth about why the greatest escape artist in NFL history chose to disappear on his own terms. Before the hidden truths unfold, we have to return to the beginning, to the world that shaped Barry Sanders long before he entered a professional stadium. He grew up in Wichita, Kansas, in a house where discipline spoke louder than praise and where nothing was given without proof that it had been earned. His father, William Sanders, taught him that success meant nothing without humility. His mother, Shirley, balanced that strictness with quiet encouragement. Their son learned early that silence could be a form of strength. It was the foundation of the man the world would later struggle to understand. When Barry arrived at Oklahoma State, he entered a program that did not fully grasp what it had in front of it. He was small by football standards, but his movements told a different story. Every cut was a whisper. Every acceleration was a flash. Within a year, the nation could no longer ignore him. He delivered one of the greatest college seasons ever recorded, setting records that still stand today. Yet even then, he rarely spoke about himself. He left the talking to the yards he created. Reporters tried to pull quotes from him, but he gave them little more than a polite smile and a simple answer. It became his pattern. The quieter he became, the louder his legacy grew. Detroit drafted him with the hope that he would save a franchise that had spent decades searching for an identity. What they received was more than a star. They received an artist. Fans watched in disbelief as he turned broken plays into miracles. They held their breath as defenders collapsed around him. They believed he could carry the weight of the entire franchise. For a while he did. Yet greatness carries a price that is rarely visible. Behind his silence were frustrations that slowly gathered like dark clouds. The front office made decisions that contradicted the vision he had for winning. Coaching changes brought instability. Missed opportunities left a bitter taste, even as he continued to produce historic numbers. Detroit leaned on him as if he were indestructible. Every weak roster, every failed season, every moment, the team needed saving. He delivered more than anyone had the right to expect. Still, he kept his emotions locked away. The media called him humble. Teammates called him private. The truth was more complicated. Silence was not just who he was. It was how he survived. It was how he stayed focused while everything around him shifted in ways he could not control. By the mid-1990s, the Lions were stuck in a cycle of hope, followed by collapse. Barry watched the franchise repeat mistakes. He felt the pressure of carrying a team that refused to evolve. He began to see the game differently. Football was still beautiful, but the environment around it had changed. Trust had thinned. Patience had faded. The conflict within him grew until it became impossible to ignore. Behind the grace of every run was a man wrestling with choices he never expected to face. Those choices would define everything that came next. The first hidden truth in Barry Sanders' story does not belong to a rival on the field. It belongs to the people who were supposed to build the path beneath his feet. The Detroit Lions front office during the early and mid-1990s held immense power. They controlled the roster, the contracts, the coaching hires, and the long-term direction of the franchise. Barry entered the league believing they shared one mission with him. He wanted to win. He assumed they did too. With time, he learned that their priorities were not always aligned with the dreams of their greatest player. The tension began quietly. Barry noticed patterns that troubled him. Talented players were allowed to walk away without meaningful attempts to keep them. Draft picks were spent on projects instead of proven pieces who could help immediately. Coaching staffs changed without continuity or strategy. The Lions celebrated his accomplishments yet failed to build a stable championship core around him. He was humble, but he was not naive. He could see that the franchise expected him to cover every flaw simply because he could do things on a football field no one else could replicate. The real fracture came in moments that are now etched into Detroit's history. One of them arrived when the Lions let key offensive linemen leave, despite their importance to the running attack. Barry never complained publicly, but those decisions cut deeper than most fans realized. He trusted the people above him to match his dedication. Instead, he watched them prioritize short-term business decisions over long-term success. In private, he questioned whether the front office truly believed in chasing a Super Bowl or simply maintaining a marketable star who could guarantee ticket sales. According to those close to him, that was the first time the seed of disillusionment began to grow. Then came the coaching turmoil. Detroit cycled through philosophies that clashed with one another. One year, the offense focused on power running. The next, it shifted to unpredictable schemes that lacked rhythm. Barry adapted to all of it, but the inconsistency chipped away at his faith in the organization. He did not need perfection. He needed direction. He needed people who treated his prime years like the precious resource they were. Instead, he was placed in systems that wasted opportunities he could see more clearly than anyone. One moment stands above the rest. It was the season when the Lions reached the playoffs with real momentum, but failed to reinforce the roster at key positions. Barry looked around the locker room and realized that other franchises were making bold moves, while Detroit seemed content to hope for miracles. He produced them often, but each one came with emotional fatigue. He knew greatness alone could not overcome structural weakness. Through all of it, he kept his silence. Fans interpreted it as calm. Teammates saw it as patience. In reality, it was disappointment buried under discipline. He refused to publicly criticize the franchise because he believed in handling conflict respectfully. But inside him, the distance grew. When he finally retired, many people searched for dramatic explanations. They looked at rivalries, coaches, family, even the pressure of fame. Few understood that one of the real reasons was the betrayal he felt from the people who should have valued his prime years with urgency. The cold truth is simple. Barry Sanders never forgave the Detroit front office for failing to match the greatness he gave them. To the public eye, Barry Sanders and head coach Wayne Fontes appeared to have one of the most stable relationships in the league. Fontes was charismatic, players loved him, and he often defended Barry in the media. But beneath that friendly exterior lived a tension that neither man ever openly discussed. The truth is that their bond was built on a fragile balance between trust and frustration. Barry respected Fontes as a person, but struggled with him as the architect of Detroit's identity. This was the second hidden truth he carried in silence. Fontes believed deeply in Barry's abilities. He saw him as the foundation of the franchise and often leaned on him to rescue broken drives. But admiration can become dependency, and dependency can become pressure. Under Fontes, Detroit's offense frequently fell into a pattern that left Barry shouldering more responsibility than any running back should. Instead of building a complete offensive system around him, the staff sometimes treated Sanders like a solution rather than a player who needed support. The result was inconsistency. The Lions could look unstoppable one week and lost the next. Barry saw the instability, but he internalized it, refusing to let criticism become public. There was also the issue of identity. Fontes wanted Detroit to be unpredictable. He believed chaos could create opportunities. Barry, however, thrived in rhythm. He needed a cohesive structure that allowed him to manipulate defenses with his vision and timing. Too often, he was handed the ball into formations that offered little protection or misdirection. He would spin, cut, and reverse the field because he had no other choice. Fans called it magic. Barry knew it was survival. He covered for the coaching staff more than they covered for him. A critical moment came during a season when Detroit had a chance to solidify itself as a true contender. Barry felt the team lacked a clear offensive identity. Decisions in key games left him confused. Play calling became erratic. Drives ended, not because of the defense, but because the strategy collapsed under pressure. Barry never called out Fontes, but those close to him noticed the subtle shift. The quiet running back, who rarely expressed frustration, suddenly seemed distant in team meetings. He respected Fontes deeply, but respect could not erase the truth that Detroit lacked the structure necessary to maximize its star. The conflict reached an internal peak when the Lions failed to adjust against a playoff opponent known for shutting down predictable offenses. Barry entered the game knowing the scheme was not built to evolve on the fly. When the offense stalled repeatedly, he absorbed the blame publicly while the real frustration stayed locked inside him. He did not resent Fontes the man. He resented the system that forced him to work twice as hard for half the results. Years later, when Barry reflected on his career, he never spoke negatively about his coach. That silence led many to assume peace. The truth is more complicated. He admired Fontes, cared for him, and understood the pressure he faced. But professionally, the gap between what Barry needed and what Detroit provided grew too wide to ignore. The cold truth. Barry Sanders never fully reconciled the conflict he felt between loyalty to his coach and the chaos he saw on the field. Barry Sanders never expressed jealousy. He never chased awards. He never cared about headlines. But even the most humble legends live with comparisons they never asked for. For Barry, that comparison had one name: Emmitt Smith. Their rivalry was rarely acknowledged publicly because Barry refused to feed narratives that belittled other players. Yet deep inside him lived a quiet tension. Not anger, not hatred. Something more complicated. A sense that the league, the media, and even history itself were determined to measure his greatness through a lens he never chose. This became one of the most powerful hidden truths in his story. The contrast between them was dramatic. Emmitt played behind one of the greatest offensive lines ever assembled. His Cowboys had stability strategy and a championship structure that complemented his style. Barry played in Detroit where unpredictability and inconsistency were constants. Yet every season the debate continued. Who was better? Who deserved the rushing crown? Who defined the era? Reporters used the rivalry for headlines. Fans used it for arguments. Barry tried to ignore it, but it followed him everywhere. The moment that troubled him most came during a season when he outperformed expectations despite Detroit's struggles. He built impossible runs from broken plays. He carried the offense through chaos. Yet the league's attention remained tilted toward the dynasty in Dallas. Barry understood why. Championships shape narratives. But understanding does not erase the emotional weight of being overshadowed by circumstances beyond your control. He never wanted to trade places with Emmitt, but he could not ignore the reality that the Cowboys' structure gave Emmitt a platform he never received. One particular game deepened the internal rivalry. Barry watched Emmitt run behind a wall of blockers that opened lanes wider than anything he had seen in Detroit. It was not envy. It was clarity. The moment he realized that talent alone does not determine legacy. Infrastructure does. Support does. Stability does. He respected Emmitt completely. But that respect came with a private recognition that their careers were judged on uneven ground. The media's portrayal of their rivalry created an unspoken pressure. Every time Emmitt won another rushing title or moved closer to the all-time record, Barry was asked to respond. He always smiled politely and offered praise. But inside, he carried a truth he never voiced. He knew he could surpass every record if the environment matched his abilities. He knew he could outrun history if the foundation beneath him was solid. This understanding became a quiet burden he carried into every season. The most symbolic moment happened after Barry retired. Emmitt continued to climb the all-time rushing list while Barry froze at 15,169 yards. Fans debated why he left. Analysts blamed personality or motivation. Few understood that Barry simply refused to chase comparisons that overshadowed the joy he once found in the sport. Leaving the game was his way of stepping out of a race he never agreed to run. The cold truth. Barry Sanders respected Emmitt Smith, but lived with a rivalry he never wanted. A rivalry shaped not by ego, but by circumstances that refused to give him a fair stage. The second most defining hidden truth in Barry Sanders' life was not shaped by teammates' rivals or even the coaching staff. It came from even higher up. It came from ownership. To the outside world, Barry was the face of the franchise. The Lions adored him, publicly marketed him relentlessly, and praised him as the greatest gift the team had ever received. But behind the curtains lived a quiet war. A battle over loyalty, direction, and the value of winning. This conflict grew year after year until it ultimately pushed Barry toward the decision that shocked the entire league. Barry entered the NFL believing that loyalty flowed both ways. He gave everything he had on the field, never demanded special treatment, and never embarrassed the franchise. In return, he expected honesty and a genuine commitment to building a contender. He understood that Detroit had limitations, but he believed effort could overcome them. What he did not expect was the pattern of decisions that hinted at something deeper. Ownership seemed more focused on stability than progress, more focused on maintaining revenue than taking risks to chase a title. The tension grew when Barry watched star players leave without serious negotiations to keep them. Whether it was offensive linemen, defensive anchors, or key role players, the message seemed clear. Detroit wanted to remain competitive but not desperate for a championship. They wanted good seasons, not great ones. Respectable results, not bold pursuits. Barry could feel the lack of urgency, and it haunted him. He never said it publicly, but in private conversations, he admitted that the franchise did not match the hunger he carried inside. A defining moment arrived in the mid-1990s when Barry approached what could have been the peak of his championship window. He was at the height of his power. He believed the team needed just a few critical acquisitions to become a legitimate Super Bowl threat. Instead, ownership stayed conservative. They avoided major trades. They bypassed free agents who could have transformed the roster. Barry interpreted these decisions not as mistakes, but as a philosophy that treated winning as optional as long as the franchise remained financially secure. Another fracture came when ownership insisted that the team's long-term identity revolve around him. Barry loved Detroit. He loved the fans, but he disliked being used as a shield for organizational shortcomings. He knew the team needed more than a single superstar to reach the next level. He offered suggestions quietly and respectfully. Many of them were ignored. He began to feel trapped between loyalty to the franchise and frustration with the people who controlled its future. The breaking point came shortly before his retirement. Barry realized that ownership planned to rebuild rather than capitalize on the remaining years of his prime. They spoke of patience. He saw it as surrender. The idea of spending his final seasons suffering through a reset devastated him. He would never publicly confront ownership. It was not in his nature. But inside him, the disappointment was overwhelming. He felt that he had given everything to the franchise and asked for only one thing in return: a genuine chance to compete for a title. When he faxed his retirement letter from London, fans around the world asked why. Analysts speculated endlessly, but those who knew him understood the real reason. Winning mattered to him more than fame, more than records, and more than longevity. When ownership chose a path that dismissed his urgency, the unspoken war ended, the cold truth. Barry Sanders walked away because he could not fight a battle for greatness, while ownership settled for comfort. For decades, fans believed Barry Sanders walked away because he was shy, exhausted, or simply too nice for the modern NFL. Others insisted he quit because Detroit kept losing. Some blamed coaching changes, contract issues, or even personality differences. But none of those explanations capture the real heart of his decision. The greatest hidden truth of Barry Sanders' life is this: his retirement was not an escape. It was a statement he never delivered with words but carved into history through silence. Barry loved football deeply. He loved the movement, the art, the freedom that came with making defenders miss by inches. He loved the noise of the crowd and the quiet that followed when he returned to the sideline. But what he loved most was the purity of the game itself, and as the years passed, he felt that purity eroding. Detroit wanted to rebuild instead of compete. Ownership asked for patience while his championship window closed. The media pressed him about Emmitt Smith's records. Fans begged him for answers. The league expected him to keep performing miracles. Everyone demanded something, and Barry realized he could no longer give what they needed without betraying who he was. The moment everything crystallized happened in the offseason before 1999. Barry studied the roster and recognized a truth he could not ignore. Detroit was not serious about closing the gap between the Lions and the elite teams. The franchise's decisions signaled a step backward. That meant he would spend the final years of his career running behind a weaker roster, carrying a heavier load, and enduring the same frustration that had shadowed him for years. He could break more records, yes. He could chase the rushing crown. He could pass Walter Payton. He could battle Emmitt Smith. But none of those achievements mattered to him if they came without a real chance to compete for a championship. To Barry, football was never about numbers. It was about meaning. It was about the pursuit of something greater than personal glory. The game he loved was changing. The franchise he trusted was settling. And the silence he had carried for a decade finally became an answer in itself. So, he left. Not with a press conference. Not with a speech. Not with bitterness. Just a single letter faxed from London, as if he were removing himself from the noise of the sport altogether. He gave no explanations because he believed explanations would only invite unnecessary drama. He understood that some people would never accept his reasons. He understood that walking away at the height of his abilities would spark endless speculation. But leaving silently was the only way to preserve the purity he valued. It was the only action powerful enough to express the disappointment he never said out loud. Years later, when asked if he regretted retiring, Barry answered calmly. He said he felt at peace. That answer confused many people, but for those who truly understood him, it made perfect sense. Barry did not retire because he was done with football. He retired because he refused to compromise what the sport meant to him. His final act was not surrender. It was defiance. It was integrity. It was the one truth he guarded more fiercely than any record. The cold truth. Barry Sanders retired not because he ran out of time. He retired because the game around him ran out of honesty. There was one figure in Barry Sanders' orbit who understood him in ways few others ever could. Herman Moore, the star wide receiver who defined Detroit's passing game throughout the 1990s, never appeared on lists of rivals or conflicts, but he belonged to a different category. He was the quiet witness. The man who saw Barry's frustrations before they crystallized. The teammate who recognized that beneath Sanders' calm exterior lived storms he would never voice publicly. Moore was not a source of tension. He was the reflection that forced Barry to confront the truth about his environment. Their careers overlapped during Detroit's most volatile era. Moore watched Sanders run through defenses while carrying the weight of a franchise that relied too heavily on his brilliance. He saw the lack of structural support. He felt the instability. He understood the emotional toll the situation created long before the public had any clue. In team meetings, he noticed how Barry grew more distant whenever discussions turned toward long-term plans. He could read the disappointment behind Barry's polite expressions, the fatigue behind his silence. One moment stays etched in Moore's memory. After a narrow loss that exposed Detroit's flaws, the locker room buzzed with frustration. Players vented. Coaches debated. But Barry sat quietly, his jersey still dusted with turf. Moore approached him expecting anger. Instead, he saw resignation. Not surrender, but acceptance. It was the moment Moore realized that Barry's loyalty to Detroit ran deeper than the franchise's loyalty to him. Years later, Moore admitted that he was not surprised by Barry's retirement. He had seen the signs long before anyone else. The silence, the distance, the quiet calculation. Moore understood that Barry did not quit. He simply chose peace over chaos. His presence was a bonus truth, a reminder that even the most isolated legends are never fully alone. Barry Sanders' story is often told through highlights, through impossible cuts that defied physics, through defenders collapsing into each other as he slipped past untouched, through numbers that place him among the greatest players to ever breathe on a football field. But the deeper truth, the one that forms the core of his legacy, is not made of yards or touchdowns. It is built from the quiet battles he fought behind the scenes. Battles with his franchise, with expectations, with comparisons, and with the shifting nature of the game itself. His legacy is not just athletic brilliance. It is the emotional weight he carried without complaint, and the integrity he refused to sacrifice, even when the world begged him to. From the beginning, Barry seemed almost too graceful for the brutality of the sport. He ran like a ghost moving through chaos. He made violence look elegant, but that elegance came with a consequence. People mistook his calm nature for indifference. They assumed he accepted every situation in Detroit with contentment. They looked at his silence and saw peace. They did not see the discipline that kept his frustrations restrained. They did not see the loyalty that kept him patient long after others would have demanded change. That misunderstanding became one of the defining elements of his career. The world believed he was unbothered. In truth, he cared deeply. He simply refused to let anger become his voice. When fans look back at the 1990s Detroit Lions, they remember flashes of hope overshadowed by instability. Barry lived through those cycles more intimately than anyone. Each season began with optimism, followed by turbulence, followed by a final push he carried almost entirely on his own shoulders. Those patterns shaped him. They hardened his resolve, but also chipped away at his belief that the organization would ever align with his internal urgency. Every year, he had to choose between faith and realism. Every year, the gap between them widened. The front office's failure to build a stable championship-level roster left scars that statistics could never reveal. Barry's brilliance masked weaknesses the franchise refused to fix. Coaches changed, systems shifted, players rotated in and out. Through all of it, Barry remained the constant, the dependable force who brought dignity to chaos. But inside him, the frustration grew. He began to see that effort alone could not overcome structural inertia. He learned that loyalty without reciprocity becomes a burden. That truth shaped the legacy he would leave behind. Then came the comparisons to Emmitt Smith. They were never fair. They were never balanced. Barry played on uneven ground. He knew it. Emmitt knew it. The league knew it. Yet, the arguments continued, creating an invisible pressure that pushed him further from the joy he once felt. He did not resent Emmitt. He respected him. But he lived with the weight of being measured by a standard built on advantages he never had. That comparison became a shadow that followed him long after he left the game. It was not the cause of his retirement, but it added to the emotional landscape that shaped it. Ownership's decisions brought everything to a breaking point. Barry gave Detroit a decade of unprecedented consistency. He never demanded headlines. He never manipulated negotiations. He never criticized the franchise publicly. He believed loyalty meant something. But when he realized that Detroit preferred stability over true contention, he saw the truth with devastating clarity. The franchise was not preparing to build around him. It was preparing to rebuild without urgency. That realization forced him to confront one of the most painful decisions of his life: stay and watch the game he loved become another burden, or leave and preserve the dignity he fought to maintain. He chose dignity. That choice turned his retirement into a cultural moment, a lesson, a statement, a refusal to let the sport distort his identity. Some people called it selfish, others called it mysterious. But those who understood him saw something different. They saw a man who valued honesty more than glory, a man who believed winning without meaning was hollow, a man who would rather walk away at his peak than compromise the principles that shaped every step of his journey. And that is where Barry Sanders' legacy becomes larger than football. He represented purity in a sport increasingly shaped by spectacle. He represented humility in an era dominated by ego. He represented integrity in a world that rewards controversy. His story is not defined by what he achieved. It is defined by what he refused to become. When he left the game, Detroit lost its brightest star. The league lost its most mesmerizing runner. Fans lost a player who turned Sunday afternoons into poetry. But Barry did not lose anything. He preserved the most important part of himself. His silence was not emptiness. It was truth. His retirement was not abandonment. It was clarity. Legacy is often measured in trophies and records. Barry's is measured in something rarer. It is measured in the respect he commands, the mystique that surrounds him, and the integrity that has never faded. His career did not end with applause. It ended with a whisper that grew louder over time. A whisper that told the world what kind of man he truly was. This is the legacy of Barry Sanders, not just the runner, the thinker, the silent fighter, the man who chose truth over applause. Barry Sanders' story is more than a biography. It is a mirror held up to the heart of football itself. It forces us to ask difficult questions about loyalty, ambition, and the unseen battles that shape a legend's path. His 5 hidden truths reveal the weight he carried quietly, the front office decisions that drained his hope, the coaching instability that forced him into survival mode, the comparison with Emmitt Smith that reshaped his understanding of legacy, the ownership philosophy that clashed with his pursuit of meaning, and the final choice he made, not out of defeat, but out of principle. These revelations transform the way we understand his career. They show us that greatness is not just built on yards gained. It is built on values protected. And now the question becomes yours. Which truth shocked you the most? The pressure he endured behind closed doors, the internal rivalry he never admitted, the silent war with ownership, or the final decision that still echoes through NFL history? Do you believe he made the right choice when he walked away at the peak of his powers? Would you have done the same if you were in his position? His story invites reflection, debate, and emotional connection because it comes from a place few athletes are brave enough to reach. If this journey through Barry Sanders' life helped you understand the man behind the highlights, then stay with us. Subscribe to NFL Hidden Truths for more untold stories from football's golden age. Stories of legends who carried burdens in silence. Stories of rivalries that shaped dynasties. Stories of hidden truths that defined entire careers. The men who built the game deserve to be remembered for everything they lived through, not just what they achieved.